Hello. Welcome to our webinar on using metal injection molding to reduce the cost of titanium medical devices. I'm Dan Cook with BoneZone, and presenting today is Joe Grochowski, President of Praxis Technology. Before we get started, a quick note to let you know that Joe will take questions after his presentation. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Joe.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan. This morning, we're going to be talking about how to use metal injection molding to reduce the cost of manufacturing titanium medical devices. Before we get into it, I have an agenda, an overview of what we'll be looking at. First, I'll briefly introduce myself and my company, our market focus, as well as our technologies. And then the bulk of the presentation will be talking about the titanium metal injection molding process. We'll look at some example applications, what constitutes a perfect MIM part, some of the advantages and some of the limitations of MIM, secondaries and finishing, as well as a business case example. And then we'll also dive into some of the historical challenges and frequently asked questions and look at some properties and microstructures. All in all, it's about 30 slides in about 25 minutes. And firstly, to introduce myself, I'm the president and founder of Praxis Technology. My roles are primarily new business development as well as R&D. Prior to Praxis, I was a co-founder with Thermat Precision Technology, which was a metal injection molding manufacturing group that focused heavily on surgical instruments and effectors for them. And prior to that, I was an engineer at the Penn State Powder Metallurgy Laboratory. Praxis Technology specializes exclusively in titanium powder metallurgy. We are the world leader in commercializing titanium powder metallurgy to make parts. We've been manufacturing titanium implants using powder metallurgy since 2008. We are a contract manufacturer, so we are typically a tier 1 supplier to the OEM. We have over 50 implants in production, and we are creeping up on 1 million implants in service made using powder metallurgy. We have 4 main manufacturing technologies. The technology we're going to focus on today is metal injection molding. That's kind of our flagship technology. It's what we're most famous for. And it really is exceptional for small, complex parts. We also make several different versions of porous titanium that's used on the surface of medical devices, and a compacted titanium, which is not really found a lot of use in the medical industry, but allows you to make a larger scale preform and then is machined to the final part, as well as some heat treatments for both metal injection molded as well as additively manufactured titanium materials. So we have focused on titanium, and our focus has also been on regulated markets. We really like to make titanium for people who need the performance of it, be it aerospace, medical device, or defense. We have all the registrations and certifications that we need to serve those markets. As far as medical market sectors go, there are a lot of great applications out there for metal injection molding of titanium. In orthopedics, you'll see bone plates, sports medicine applications, in spinal areas, interbody devices, as well as external fixation devices. Vascular access ports are a great application. Electronic packaging and surgical instruments. So all of these market sectors we either have production parts in or parts being evaluated in. So they are very practically good applications for the technology. So thank you for that. I just wanted to introduce our company and our focus. And now the remainder of the talk is about titanium injection molding. So I like to say, think about what you could do if you could mold titanium like plastic. So we use a conventional molding process and a conventional plastic molding process. And what you get from that is the versatility of being able to use a plastic injection molding tool to form complex shapes. But because you're using an injection molding process, it's very repeatable. And it's also, because of the scale, very economical. So the manufacturing process, if you're not familiar with metal injection molding, first we start off with making a thermoplastic feedstock, a molding compound, where we take the titanium powder and we combine it with the thermoplastic binder. This creates a thermoplastic molding compound that we call feedstock. That feedstock is then introduced to what is effectively a conventional plastic injection molding machine with a very similar configuration to a conventional machine. So this melts the thermoplastic component of the binder, not the titanium powder, just the binder, and allows it to be injected into the plastic injection molding tool to form a complex article. So when the article comes out of the mold, it's still a composite mixture of plastic and titanium powder. And the next step is to begin removing the binder components, the plastic components. So we do a first stage debinding where we wash out about half of the binder. The other half is removed during the sintering and consolidation process. So in the first step of the sintering, we thermally decompose the remainder of the binder and sweep it out of the parts. Then we heat the part up to a sintering temperature, which is quite high, typically in the range of 1200 Celsius. The part solidifies, and after that, we subject it to a hipping process, which we'll talk about in more depth later. At the end, you've got a finished part that can be very complex as you can make an injection molding tool, but you haven't actually done any machining operations on it. So it really lends itself to parts that are complex and you need to make a lot of. I put together this graphic to kind of show the lay of the land of where different titanium manufacturing technologies fall for medical device manufacturing. The main idea is you've got both the quantity that you need to make every year and the part complexity. On the left-hand side, obviously, stamping is a great way to make a tremendous volume of parts, but you're limited in the complexity that you can make. On the other end of the graphic, additive manufacturing, you can make a very complex part, but it doesn't have great scalability from a cost perspective. Conventional machining takes up a large portion of this landscape. If you have medium and low complexity and high volumes, it's a great way to do it. If you have a more complex part and enough annual volumes to justify investing in an injection molding tool, that's where titanium metal injection molding really is the perfect solution. The combination of complexity and volume makes for a very good titanium MIM application. So there are a lot of applications out there. We found a lot of success in implantable devices. The combination of reducing the material usage as well as eliminating machining or greatly reducing machining steps can deliver a lot of cost savings, typically over 30%. It can be much higher than that depending on the case. People really like this process because it has much more design flexibility than conventional machining. Your design for manufacturability considerations are more similar to plastic injection molding than machining. And once it's tooled, it can scale rapidly. We've found some other applications in electronic packaging. Again, very small, complex parts. The injection molding process really excels at that. And although we don't really pursue a lot of consumer applications, but we have found some great consumer applications have found us. There are applications out there that really do need titanium, and titanium helps them make their product better. So thinking about what makes a perfect metal injection molding part, the first thing to talk about is the concept of effective density. So when you machine a part out of a block, how much of that material ends up in the part and how much of it ends up as machined turnings. And that gives you an idea of how much material you can save when you use a powder metal process. This is a really great application. This part occupies about 6% of the volume of that block that's shown there, which translates into over 90% material waste when you machine a part like this. So that's one of the first things to think about when you look at a part. Complexity and a lot of material savings tends to drive the value proposition. When we talk about complexity, basically something that is currently made on a 5-axis machining operation or requires multiple machining operations is a pretty good candidate for a MIM part. Also, small size really helps the value proposition, as well as a high annual volume. The high annual volume makes it easier to offset the tooling investment. So that example that I showed in the previous slide is not just a nice example, it's also a production part. It's a great example of metal injection molding being used to give designers a lot of flexibility and also lower the cost of making the part. Of course, there are limitations. So I would like to talk a little bit about those. The limitations of MIM are usually initially around the molding of it. So if you need to make long, thin parts, if you're injection molding a long, thick section, that's always challenging, especially because these materials are highly filled. So if you have a part that's currently being cut out of a tube, that's probably the most economical way to do it. The same thing could be said for like a wide, thin part that's currently being stamped. Stamping is a great way to make a high volume of a not that complex of a part, and it's going to be hard for MIM to compete with that. Other considerations are large size. We say kind of over 25 grams or over a quarter inch in thickness. These are not so much technical limitations. You can make larger parts, but they do end up having a lot of more extra processing considerations, and it tends to not make as good of a business case. So it's kind of that classic, just because you can doesn't mean you should case. Also, radial symmetry without complexity. So if you can make it on a lathe or you can make it on a Swiss screw machine, that's probably the best way to make it. It's very hard to compete with those kind of forming operations. There's always questions about tolerances. We say typically plus or minus 0.2%. It can be as good as plus or minus 0.1%, although that has to be kind of looked at on a case-by-case basis. There's a lot of considerations to that. And also, how small is too small? Well, we can actually mold some very small parts as long as we don't get into the long aspect ratio issues. So these are example parts of, these are each less than 20 milligrams each. So it's a neat technology for making a small complex part. There are a lot of advantages in design flexibility that's available to us because we are making a tool rather than an injection molding tool to form this part rather than cutting it out of a block. Any kind of corners or edges can be made smooth to be exactly whatever radius or geometry you would like. There's no machining burrs or sharp edges. Also, because of the way that it's processed, there's no residual stresses. And because you are investing in a tool to make your part up front, oftentimes added complexity can be added into the part without actually creating extra costs. So that could show up as molded in positional indication, identification features, and sometimes you can even combine assemblies to make a more complex part. On the right-hand side there, I have an example that I like a lot. It's a shelf pin. On the right side of the image, you can see, your conventional shelf pin, but also on the left-hand side, the metal injection molded version of it. So while this isn't titanium, regrettably, there's not much of a market for titanium shelf pins. This is still a great use case because you can see, one, there's a greatly increased complexity to the part, which increases the performance of the part, but also there's a 40% reduction in the weight of the part. And they've also been able to take advantage of the fact that they were building a tool and were able to put some molded in markings in there. So it's a really neat technology that shows what you can do when you go away from a normal conventional forming and you start using injection molding to form your metal. Imagine what this could do to any number of products. A very common question is, okay, so we have this titanium material, but does it behave like conventional titanium? And this is something that we're very proud of. Our metal injection molding material not only has all the properties that it needs to have, but it behaves effectively identically to conventional titanium, whether you need to do CNC machining, mass finishing, laser marking, passivation, anodization. We have some specialized heat treatments for sintered titanium. So anything that you need to do to a normal conventional part, we can also do successfully to a titanium part. I do want to just make a quick mention about CNC machining. Oftentimes, it's always a value proposition. Sometimes we need to put a secondary operation in and machine one or two details onto a MIM part, but it still comes out saving the customer a lot of money. It really depends on the part. Sometimes the part is net shape. Sometimes the part is near net shape and perhaps has the most common thing that we do is to put a thread in because it's more economical to machine a thread than to build a complex tool that forms the thread in the molding operation. Also, from surface properties, a sintered part has a nice surface finish, about 63 microinches. We typically bead blast everything that we do, which knocks it down to about 30. And we also do an awful lot of mass finishing. A lot of implants want to have a kind of very shiny, near mirror finish. We say below 16, we can oftentimes get below 10, and we have yet to not been able to provide a customer with the surface finish that they were happy with. A great business case example is this vascular access part. The part weight can be in the range of 5 to 15 grams, depending on the part. Typical annual volumes. This is a part that can range between 10,000 to 100,000 pieces and is conventionally manufactured on a 5-axis CNC machine. A CNC machine price can be in the $25 to $30 range. The MIM price can be in the $15 to $20 range. So taking those kind of assumptions and using kind of the middle ground of them, the typical cost for a 2-cavity mold that looks something like this would be about $45,000, as well as NRE and validation could be in the range of $30,000. So you've got a total investment of $75,000 in the tool and getting it qualified. However, if you're saving $5 a part on a $25 part, and you just take the median volume of 50,000 parts a year, you very quickly pay back that investment in about 3 months. So while this is a great business case, and it underscores, where the volume plays a hand in it. So while it is technically feasible to set up a MIM process that can run 1,000 parts a year, it really needs the annual volume to offset the tooling and the setup costs. I want to take a couple minutes to talk about the historical challenges of titanium metal injection molding. A lot of smart people would tell you that titanium MIM doesn't work. And that 20 years ago was true, but we have changed the nature of that. But the basis of the challenges that are the same. So titanium is extremely sensitive to contamination. A very small amount of oxygen or carbon is very detrimental to its mechanical properties. And then there's kind of a double whammy that not only is it sensitive to contamination, but it's especially reactive, especially when you heat it up. And further, titanium powder has a lot of surface area, so that just creates even more opportunity for reaction. So one of the big challenges of titanium is getting the powder consolidated and through the process without picking up enough contamination to detriment the mechanical properties. So that's the kind of the material science challenges, but also because the normal users for titanium are really relying on its performance, whether it's medical, aerospace, or defense. There have been adoption challenges because all of those industries are regulated and for very good reasons, risk adverse. So we have overcome all of these challenges. The material science headaches are due to years of investment and development. We have a qualified process that consistently delivers exceptional performance. We've done this we have a titanium-only facility. We only process titanium powder at our facility. We have developed custom feedstocks that limit the binder contamination and the opportunity to contaminate the material in the process, as well as developed special processing routes to limit the interstitial pickup. And then from an industry perspective, there are 2 ASTM medical specifications. One's for the Ti-64 material, and the other is for commercially pure material. So that really helps overcome adoption challenges, having a good specification. And also, we have an FDA master file that has a bunch of compatibility studies, biocompatibility studies in that our customers use in their filings. So all of that has kind of come together to take it from something that was once considered impossible to something that's used every day to make implantable product. So I do want to take a quick look at the mechanical specifications. I'm not going to read this whole table off to you, but it is important to know how the metal injection material fits into the world of existing specifications. Starting on the left, this table shows us the very common ELI specification, as well as the normal grade 5 normal interstitial specification, as well as the standard specification for titanium 6.4 MIM. All the way on the right are our typical values for our process. When you're looking at a titanium metal injection molding process, there's 2 things that you really want to look at. The first is the yield strength. As you can see, the ASTM specification kind of fits from a yield strength perspective. The MIM spec is kind of nestled between the ELI and the normal interstitial specs. Our typical values exceed all three of those. It ranges from 115 KSI to 125, and the MIM spec is 120. The other thing that you want to look at when you're looking at titanium MIM is the oxygen specification. So our process delivers a product that's typically under 1800 ppm, which works very well with the normal interstitial and the MIM specification. The ELI specification specifies 1300 ppm of oxygen. That at this point is not commercially feasible. On the other hand, we have had a lot of success with customers using the normal interstitial material instead of ELI material. As far as we can tell, there's no downside to going with normal interstitial, and you do pick up a little extra strength. I'm not going to spend any more time on this, but if you would like to look at this further, please reach out to me and I'd be happy to dive into it with you. One of the questions that you often get about metal injection molding and also titanium is, what about porosity? All MIM parts have porosity. It's very rare that you'll find a sinter in operation where there's zero porosity. What we do is, while you'll certainly get very good properties in a part that only has a couple percent of porosity, we hot isostatically press it to kind of eliminate that discussion. So all of our product is hot isostatically pressed. If you're not familiar with that process, hot isostatic pressing is basically a furnace that's inside of a pressure vessel. So the parts are put into this press, they are heated up and then pressurized with gas. And this basically squeezes the pores out of the parts and creates a pore-free material. So on the left-hand side, you have a typical sintered titanium geometry or a microstructure that is about 95% dense with a very nice even distribution of pores. And on the right-hand side is the same material after it's been hot isostatically pressed. And this is effectively 100% dense and very repeatable. While we're looking at microstructures, we can take a brief look at what a titanium MIM microstructure looks like compared to a ROT microstructure. On the left-hand side is a ROT 6.4 microstructure. There are many 6.4 microstructures possible based on the thermal and mechanical history, but this is representative of what you would see if you took a piece of bar stock off the shelf and cut it up. It's got some directionality from working. And we can say the same thing for the TiMIM microstructure. This is what a sintered titanium microstructure should look like. This has been hipped to 100% dense. And you can see it doesn't have any directionality from working because it isn't worked. Notably, also, there's no inclusions or any pores. Another question that we get about PM products in general, both MIM and additive, is that they're understood to have lesser dynamic performance. And that is true at some level. A sintered microstructure typically has a lesser dynamic performance. But in the case where you need increased performance, we have heat treatments available to improve the microstructure and improve the mechanical performance. On the left-hand side, we have the unheat treated structures, and on the right-hand side, we have the heat treated microstructures. In the top left-hand corner, you have what's a typical MIM or binder jet geometry. It has, it's very isotropic, no directionality, and it has very good tensile properties, and it will have consistent dynamic performance at about 70 KSI rotating beam fatigue at 10 million cycles. Below that is a selectively melted microstructure. I like to kind of throw that in there because this heat treatment is effective for both these types of microstructures. You can see some of the typical orientation from a selectively melted product here. This will have acceptable static properties, but you will see inconsistent dynamic performance in this type of microstructure. So after heat treatment, you can see that both of these microstructures are now highly refined and also very homogeneous and isotropic. The heat treatment improves both the static and dynamic properties, and you'll see that you'll get a very consistent dynamic performance over 90 KSI. So it's a great improvement that puts it as good as plate. And I can share with you that this is an important part of how we have got our parts qualified for the aerospace industry, is to heat treat it for exceptional dynamic performance. Here's a fatigue curve showing how that kind of stacks up. On the top is our heat-treated MIM material, and the lower end in red is the more conventional 6.4 MIM material. There's also a very nice uptick in the static properties. So 155 KSI UTS and 140 yield strength. Notably, it hasn't changed the elongation a whole lot. We still have a very nice, robust elongation at 16%. So the key takeaway is that you can have all of the cost savings and design flexibility of MIM, and if you really need high performance in the fatigue department, we can heat treat it and get you a 25% increase in the fatigue performance that would be on par with plate. You also get a 10% increase in the static strengths and a nice 20% uptick in hardness. All this is done with no change in the material chemistry. It retains its TI 6.4 compliance, and it's also suitable for both MIM and additively manufactured product. So this is something that we developed to kind of extend where TiMIM can be applied. We do a good bit of R&D at Praxis, all with the intent of either developing new processes or materials via titanium powder metallurgy, and also supporting our existing processes. We have two full-time employees, and a couple of our current products. We're working on nitinol for metal injection molding. We're also doing a lot of work on sinter-based additive, which has got some really neat advantages as it begins to grow up and get commercialized. And also a PM-TI-based 6242 titanium, which is a creep-resistant alloy that is very popular in the aerospace defense world. So this concludes my presentation. Before we get into the question and answer session, I want to pose a couple of questions to you. With all the understanding of what titanium MIM can deliver from both the cost savings and a design flexibility, what would it mean to you or your company if you could save 30 or 50% on the production costs of titanium components? And then two, the question I think is really exciting. When you get this technology in front of designers and engineers, how can you use the design flexibility to either differentiate or improve your titanium products? So just some thoughts about how to contextualize what I've just shared with you. And at this point, we're ready to take some questions. And also, I do want to mention to you that we'll be at OMTech in a couple of weeks. We're at booth 647. So if you're there, please stop by and say hi. We'll have lots of demonstration parts to look at. Thank you very much for your attention. At this point, we can take some questions.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate your presentation and insightful expertise. Just to start us off, Joe, you talked about TIM being perfect for producing complex parts in a high volume. Can you provide a few examples of specifically orthopedic applications that you see a lot of that really takes advantage of this technology?
Well, one of my favorite examples is unthreaded suture anchors. There's a tremendous amount of these that are made for mostly for sports medicine, but they have very complex shapes, very fine detail, and usually used in high volumes. So we have actually spent a lot of time developing the processing and polishing technologies to take a metal injection molded part and make it visually indistinguishable from a machined part. So there's no gates, there's no parting lines. It's just they're just beautiful parts, and it's a great application.
Cool. What other titanium materials do you make?
Well, our workhorse is grade 5, which is the TI 6.4 alloy that we spend most of that time doing. We also do CP, and one of the neat things about titanium powder metallurgy is you can do custom or exotic alloys very readily by combining metallic materials to form the desired composition. The neat part of this is the alternative to that is that you might have to buy a 20,000 pound billet of a custom alloy to make some very small parts. So titanium powder metallurgy offers a lot of flexibility from a material perspective.
Gotcha. And what is the typical lead time for tooling that you?
Well, typical is hard because you don't know which part you're talking about, but it can go from 6 weeks to 12 weeks, depending on the complexity of the tool.
Gotcha. Okay. And do you also do additive manufacturing?
We spend a lot of time looking at additive manufacturing. We don't aspire to really do any selective melting, but if you're familiar with green part additive or sinter-based additive technologies, those fit very well into a metal injection molding equipment train. And also, we can capitalize on our expertise in sintering powders to make those technologies something that can be validated and commercially viable.
Okay. We have a question in from Greg Denham. He said that you mentioned unthreaded suture anchors. Why not threaded? Peak threaded anchors are molded with some of the thread concessions of at the parting line.
That's a very good point. If you make the thread concessions at the parting line, then the metal injection molding process would work very well for threaded as well.
Gotcha. Okay.
Great point. Thank you for that question.
And Joe, you talked about the customization and making complex parts and just really customizing the designs. Talk about the importance of that in today's orthopedic world in terms of what device manufacturers are trying to produce.
Well, there's constant innovation in these areas, which that's what people are using to differentiate their products, come up with different surgeries, different solutions, and this is a great tool to have in front of designers, because once they get comfortable with the idea of it, then they want to use it all the time, because it overcomes a lot of the headaches of, well, you can't do that, or that's going to be especially difficult to machine. It's the design flexibility is, it's one of these things that it usually starts out where people are like, oh, cost savings, but then as they get more comfortable with it and incorporating from the beginning, they really like what it brings to their designers and engineers.
Great. We have a question in from Kevin Wolchin. What kind of defects do you run into, and what are production yields like?
Our production yields are quite high. All of our processes are qualified, so we know that the run will have that. A sinter run, everything is sintered in batches. Will have acceptable properties. We do test for that, but that's rarely where we have yield issues. Our challenges come in because we do a tremendous amount of visual inspection on the parts. A lot of our surgically implanted components have very high visual requirements. So a small ding or any little, very minor, even not perceptible to the eye, it can get a part scrapped. So that tends to be where we find most of our losses in production.
Gotcha. Okay. Unless we have any other questions, give it a few seconds, but I'd like to thank our attendees. We hope you took away valuable and insightful information. You can learn more about Praxis and their expertise at praxisti.com. An on-demand version of this webinar will be published on bonezonepub.com, and you'll all receive an email when it goes live. So thank you, Joe, again. It was a great discussion, and really appreciate your time and insights. And with that, we hope you have a great day.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you everyone for attending.
Sure.